Ladies and gentlemen, warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Netherlands Atlantic Association. I see a lot of familiar faces and some new, a lot of diplomats, former ministers. And there's a reason for this, because we are celebrating a birthday. Nato at 70. But you could also say, it's your birthday, because you all here, as you are gathered here, are funding NATO. So, my congratulations to you. And the question today is, do you get value for money? For 70 years, NATO's existence has been self-evident. The first NATO chief, Lord Ismay, said that NATO was created to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. This famous phrase is reviving today. Many NATO countries are worried how to keep the Americans in. A friend of mine, former US NATO ambassador and US Undersecretary Nick Burns, now professor at Harvard, testified a couple of days ago in Congress. President Trump has chosen to become NATO's chief critic, rather than its strong and unifying leader. Trump has questioned the value of NATO and not wholeheartedly supported Article 5. And the speech that NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg yesterday gave to a joint session of Congress was also a pitch. He strongly made the case for NATO, referring to Russia as the biggest threat. At the same time, Trump rightfully complains about the European contributions to NATO. Only 7 out of 29 NATO countries meet the agreed standard of 2% of GDP. And sorry, Hester, and other people who are emotionally linked to this subject, NATO is still waiting for the Dutch. The Netherlands is dragging behind at 1.35%. NATO is not excluded from a broader rift in the West. There are unseen divisions between Europe and the Trump administration. From trade to Iran, and from Israel to climate. And we are seeing a rising populism and also a rise of autocratic leadership across Europe and across the globe, and it's threatening our institutions from within. So we have enough turbulence for a debate with a great panel. Let me introduce, on the far end, Elisabeth Braw, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London, where she works on defense and existing and new threats. She has been a journalist for a long time, and she still is a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, Foreign Policy and Political, focusing on European defense and security. She's a native of Sweden and lived in many, many countries. This is Germany, Italy, United States. Then we have Christian Leuprecht. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science and Economics at the Royal Military College of Canada. He's a Canadian. And he's also an Eisenhower Fellow at the NATO Defense College. He's affiliated to many universities and many think tanks. He has a new book out titled Public Security in Federal Politics. And today he has an op-ed in Canada's largest newspaper, the Globe and Mail, on NATO's birthday and its problem. Then we have Hester Somsen, the director of the Security Policy Department at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Prior to that, she was the Dutch ambassador to Lebanon, and before that she was head of crisis management and peacekeeping operations at the ministry. TV watchers might have seen Hester recently alongside Minister Bloch in a bilateral meeting with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. I'm just saying this to express how close advisor she is to Minister Bloch. Then we have our veteran in our panel, Stan Sloan, visiting scholar in political science at Middlebury College, non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States. He has taught many courses on NATO, also at NATO's Defense College in Rome. He concluded government service as senior specialist in international security policy at the Congressional Research Service after serving at the CIA as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a warm welcome. With so much intellect in the room, I'm getting more humble by the second. All the panelists will have 1 minute to deal with the past. That's enough for 70 years, isn't it? What has NATO brought us in the past 70 years? And then they will have a minute on the future. What big strategic questions brings the future for NATO? And this is the second round triggers automatically our plenary debate, and at a certain moment I hope you will step in. Now let's start with Elisabeth. Elisabeth, 1 minute for you on 70 years of NATO. What has this delivered us?
You're a tough ringmaster. Can I just say first, I'm the proud wife of a proud Dutch American from the great city of Grand Rapids, where really the majority of people are Dutch American, and most common surname is De Vries. And in the great city of Grand Rapids, I have yet to meet a single person who thinks NATO is bad or who thinks that it's wrong for the US to be as committed as it is to European security. Even though Grand Rapids is in the middle of America, it's not exposed to any sort of threats of the kind that we face here, as you know. And I think that says something. So that's my straw poll from the great city of Grand Rapids. 70 years of NATO. If I can just give a few snapshots. So in 1982, you may remember, there was a big debate about Russian exports of gas to Germany. And as part of writing a book, having just finished a book about East Germany, I went through the propaganda instructions that East German officials received about what to say about this. And the funny thing is, it's essentially the same thing we're seeing today again. The Americans are complaining, and so the instructions went like this: all the Americans are complaining about these Russian exports, of course, went through Eastern Germany and East Germany at the time, and that is really terrible because it's really just about gas. And lo and behold, we're having the same conversation today, and the NATO survived just fine, even though the Americans were upset with West Germany at the time. And then the double track decision. Massive demonstrations in West Germany against this decision, as many of you will remember. Then in the early 90s, and I remember this as being as a student at the time in what was then Eastern Germany, former East Germany, early to mid-90s, the really incredible situation where you had the Red Army there in great numbers until 1994, alongside the Bundeswehr, which had arrived, of course, as the new armed forces of this part of the country, existing alongside each other, and by the way, exercising alongside each other. NATO could have gotten itself into a really, really dangerous situation there, but yet it survived. And now we're at this juncture where we think, oh, it's terrible, the tension is tearing us apart, and how will this end well? Well, we have, I think, experience within NATO, 70 years on the day, 70 years of experience of tensions within NATO, and yet this organization has fulfilled its promise for these 70 years of preventing, deterring an invasion of its member states.
Thank you. Is this an optimistic anecdote for you?
Yes, it is.
Yeah? So history repeats to some extent.
Well, it does. Then imagine a democracy where everybody got along all the time. It would not be a democracy. It would be an authoritarian government where decisions or opinions were streamlined. In free and open societies, we will have these tensions, and nobody has any illusions that all of NATO's members would agree all the time. And to my mind, the biggest problem is not we have free rider problems in any situation where more than two people are together, because somebody will try to get away with less than the others. And it starts with city buses. So to my mind, the big problem is not defense spending, but the caveat scourge. So a number of NATO member states put caveats, as you know, on what they will do in particular situations, which means that often it's the Americans who have to do most of the work and most dangerous work. So countries say, oh, we'll do this and this and this, but not the dangerous part, so the American infantry has to do that. I think that's a bigger problem than the spending, because it suggests that American lives are worth less than some European lives.
Yeah. Thank you. Christian, are you as optimistic as Elisabeth is on the past 70 years?
So look, I do need to start with a shout out to Bram, because coming here, these are the best conversations that I have about collective defense and about NATO from all the events that I go to. And I always think like what the Atlantic Committee does and so questions we get is second to none. And so I think that also demonstrates the broader interest. And I know that some of you, especially the female persuasion, have probably looked at my garb here and are wondering, whether I can't coordinate my different colors of blue. But I actually did that quite deliberate, because I think this is sort of reflexive of the NATO lines. There's lots of different shades of blue, and then somehow we all kind of try to mesh this together and make it all work. And it's not always pretty, but in the end you can wear it and you can show up in public and it sort of works. And I think that's sort of emblematic of the alliance as a whole. I also like to point out that, of course, in 1949, at the signing of the accord, any of you like Gershwin musicals, Porgy and Bess? So as the Marine Corps band played, one of the songs was "Ain't Got a Whole Lot of Nothing." I always think that might be emblematic of NATO, because I think throughout the entire Cold War we were all a little unsure whether all the command structure and all the bureaucracy and all the hoopla about NATO notwithstanding, whether if push came to shove, this organization could actually deliver. But I think one of the fantastic things about this organization is its ability not just to think militarily, but first and foremost politically. And look, I think it is a fantastic success. It is the historically most enduring military alliance we've ever seen. It is also the most successful military alliance, I think, that we've ever seen. Look, here's 12 countries that get together in 1949. Now we're looking at 29 plus a new country joining. NATO sure does not have a Brexit problem. Nobody's trying to leave. Lots of people are trying to get in. So I would think there's a definite popularity. It's a popular place to be, let me tell you, especially if you live in dangerous neighborhoods. If you also think about, so NATO today covers about 1 billion people, and across those 29 countries, they produce about half the world's GDP. Now, when we started with NATO, the US alone generated over half of the world's GDP. So if you think about this, I think this is both a fantastic accomplishment for the alliance as a whole, because the alliance was never just a military instrument. It was always a broader strategic instrument to build stability, harmony, prosperity, and the rule of law. And if you think about, people always complain about, so that we invest 2% or not, but look, 2% was always an aspirational goal. And look, no offense to my dear friends in Latvia, but if Latvia spends 2% or Canada spends 1 point something percent, you get very different effects out of that. And so I think ultimately this is about contributions, commitments, capabilities that people can bring to bear. And in that regard, no contribution in NATO is ever too small. Whatever a country wants to commit, the alliance is happy to take, and everybody knows that they have a broader role to play. But while we complain about how little this is, if you think about it as an insurance policy, one of the benefits of our countries is how little we actually have to pay for this insurance policy and what we actually get out of that policy. So if you think about the fantastic growth in GDP, and you think about the rest of the world, so the other half of GDP, so NATO accounts for about 60% or so of global defense spending on about half the world's GDP. That is to say, we get a discount on defense spending and the premium we pay relative to GDP, while everybody else ends up paying substantially more in order to generate those security effects for themselves. And of course, every dollar that these countries spend on security and defense and whatnot is money that's not there to promote economic growth, stability, harmony, rule of law, and whatnot. And so I think there's important political trade-offs here. And in that regards, I think I'll end on that famous Mark Twain quote, when they ran his obituary and he said, the reports of my death are somewhat premature. I think, we've been at this precipice several times, and I think the Alliance has an amazing resilience and sustainability to adapt to changing security environments and the payoff that it delivers.
So about value for money?
Better value for money than most people let on. And I think ultimately every democracy has to make its own trade-offs, but as I point out in my op-ed, US complaints about the ability of partners to spend more are not entirely unfounded, because if we think back to NATO's founding and we think back to the Marshall Plan, one of the objectives was precisely to build a harmonious, prosperous Europe. And I think there is, rightly or wrongly, a sense and a broad consensus in the United States that the Americans, having made this investment in Europe and European allies, that perhaps there's an opportunity for these allies to do a bit more in terms of the return on investment that the US might expect. And Trump is unilateralism with a frown, Barack Obama was unilateralism with a smile, but ultimately it's always going to be US unilateralism. We've always had criticisms of spending within the alliance, but I think we've come to a time and to a point where the challenges that we face, whether it's on the northeastern flank, whether it's with regards to the asymmetric challenges of domestic instability and anti-terrorism, or whether it's on the southern Mediterranean flank, the current premium may not be sufficient to get us the collective returns that we'll all be looking for as a group of countries.
Okay. Hester, better value for money than many people think?
I think so. And if you, let me first also thank Wilm and the Atlantic Commission for bringing us all together. And I feel a bit humble also, as you just expressed amongst this panel. But I'm also in very good company, I think, when it comes to what Elisabeth was saying and also what Christian was saying. NATO has brought us a great deal. I might even say that NATO has brought us happiness. That might not be the word that people connect to NATO, but if you look at the happiness index of 2019, there's many NATO countries that are in the top ranks of the happiness index. And I think that really goes to your point as well when it comes to the GDP and when it comes to the insurance that we've had for such a long time. 70 years of peace, I think, is something that is historically unique, that we should cherish as well. Europe especially has benefited a lot of the safety umbrella that we have enjoyed from NATO. If you see that it has given us time for the European integration, it has given us time also to enlarge, it has given us new friends, and I think that is also something that the Atlantic Bond has brought us all, and I think Secretary General yesterday in his speech made that very clear also, that it's very good to have friends. And these friends you would need in different times, the times that Elisabeth, I think, just referred to, but also the times in future. So in that respect, I think we're happy to have NATO, and we should be happy to have NATO around for another 70 years.
You don't hear diplomats often talking about happiness.
No, but I thought let's have another angle in that respect.
Yeah, but you mean it?
Yeah, I do, yes. Yes, and of course there's talks within the alliance about sometimes American unilateralism, and of course there's difference between the weight of the friends that they have, and there's some friends who are closer within this family in NATO than others. But nevertheless, I think it's an alliance that keeps us very much together, and that we need also in the future.
Okay, Stan, how happy are you looking back?
I look at myself as a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist, and I'm still that way. I just realized today, with all the focus on 70 years, that I've been working on NATO crises for 50 of those 70 years. And so that does add to perspective. But most recently, last September, along with Dick Burns, I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the question of what does NATO do for the United States. And I think I had 13 points that I made in that testimony. But what it really comes down to is my judgment that, in fact, NATO tends to enhance American power and influence, and that in many ways NATO is an enabler for American interests and a force and influence multiplier. And I think that was I had a lot of specifics that I told the senators, but that was the main point. And I also, in my statement, made the assertion that no one has ever come up with a better plan for European interests and American interests than what we have, roughly. And that's not saying that the alliance can't be improved, that we can't make reforms, but it is saying that I've never seen another formula that would work as well. There was one final thing that I didn't tell the senators, at least not directly, and that is that I think the alliance for the United States, one of the values of the alliance for the United States, is the fact that we have like-minded allies, countries that more or less believe in the same values, the same approach to governance. We have these allies that can give us advice, that can criticize us when they think we're wrong. And sometimes Americans don't like that idea, but I think we should listen more carefully and more often when our friends tell us that perhaps we're headed in the wrong direction. And I think that's one of the real values that NATO brings to the United States, that perhaps is undervalued by American members of Congress and administrations, but it's there, and I think some of them know it.
Yeah. Congress is playing an important role, as we saw yesterday with organizing that speech from the Secretary of NATO. How would you describe the mood in Congress towards NATO?
Well, of course, I'm not working for them any longer, but having worked for them for 23 or 4 years, I've got a pretty good sense. I still follow them from my outpost in Vermont. But the mood in the Congress is very strongly in favor of NATO. Some of that comes from the fact that the President has been so critical of NATO. And that was unacceptable not only for virtually all of the Democrats in Congress, but for most of the Republicans as well. And it's stunning that in fact Stoltenberg would be invited to address a joint session of Congress. And it's almost like poking a finger in Trump's eye. And sometimes like that, in a sense. But in any case, it was quite stunning. And all of the critical votes that have been taken on NATO issues over the last 3 years have been very positive in favor of the alliance. So I'd say the mood is very good. That doesn't mean that members of Congress don't want Europeans to do more, because we talk about the future. I'm sure we're going to say the United States will still be looking for the Europeans in the future to do more. That is more or less an American consensus and logical interest. But for the time being, certainly strong support, and in public opinion as well.
Thank you. Now let's look at the future. Again, another 1 minute, is that possible? What big strategic questions are ahead of NATO?
If I can highlight, can I talk about education as a strategic question?
Yeah, we talked about happiness, now talk about education. So
education is a strategic question because it is about the future, and I think something that is often forgotten about NATO is we all talk about it as how do these diplomats get along? What is the atmosphere among diplomats? What is the what is the atmosphere at NATO HQ? But actually, most of NATO is about the soldiers who are out there doing the daily work of a defense alliance, which is to defend our countries. And so we are here in the country of Erasmus. The EU spends enormous amounts of money on the Erasmus program, which is and unto itself. So you get to spend a term or a year at another European university, which is fantastic. But NATO gets that simply by being NATO. So its soldiers go on, the member soldiers go on constant rotations to various countries and get that cultural exchange on top of doing their daily work, which is their military job. And so that's something that's often forgotten, but the result is that we have generations of soldiers of all nationalities who have served in other NATO countries and have come away committed transatlanticists or multilateralists as a result of it. And I don't know about everybody here in the room, but I can tell you, me personally, there is not a single American officer who hasn't said, oh, when I was a lieutenant in Germany or when I was a captain in Germany, and they all had a good time. Some even had German girlfriends and married German women. Well, this is the result of NATO, and so we have we have generations of soldiers and officers who are essentially now the core of the transatlantic relationship. We don't hear from them very often because we hear from politicians and diplomats and think tank types. And looking to the future, I wish we would hear from these people more who have been doing the daily work of NATO on the ground, and actually done it very well, because we, as you said initially, we haven't had a delegation in NATO member states, which was the goal of the alliance to begin with.
Okay, more marriages with NATO. But what is the big strategic thing that keeps you busy?
Well, it's the changing nature of warfare. So while we're busy debating about whether Germany should spend 1.25 or 1.51 or 2%, or other countries as well for that matter, including the Netherlands, the nature of aggression that our countries face is changing, and so it makes little sense to still be counting tanks and other military hardware as some sort of indication of our ability to defend ourselves and deter that aggression, which, by the way, is increasingly directed at civil society and not at our armed forces. And it's directed at civil society because our armed forces are so good. So if you face an obstacle somewhere, you go around and find a more an easier target. And in this case, in our liberal democracies, in NATO countries, it is civil society. So what do we do about that? NATO ACT is actually doing, in Norfolk, Virginia, is doing impressive work trying to figure out what that defense and deterrence should look like. But that is the biggest challenge, and it will involve more than armed forces. Our countries will have to figure out, well, how does it all hang together? And this is also something that we focus on at the program I did at Brucey. So it's extremely, it's urgent and also an extremely rewarding area to focus on, because there's so much room for improvement and innovation.
Yeah. Christian, the nature of aggression is changing. Is that also one of your worries? Or do you have other big strategic questions?
Yeah, so look, I think there's a lot of disruption on the horizon, and I think those people who are critical of NATO, if you think the last 30 years were interesting, just watch the next 30 years. There's going to be 3 billion more people on the planet. We have significant climate change, which is affecting some of the most unsustainable places that are already politically, economically, socially, ethnically among the most least sustainable places on the planet. So I think the 3 fronts that I just mentioned aren't going to go away anytime soon. I think the technological disruption that we've seen has made democracy more fragile than it has ever been, and I think more than ever before, democracy is not to be taken for granted. Democracy needs to be defended. If you look in particular, for instance, at the efforts at systematic subversion of our democratic institutions, democratic processes, so the way social media and technology has made democracy more fragile, at the same time how it has enabled authoritarian regimes, and how authoritarian regimes are leveraging it to prolong their longevity and reach, because it provides disproportionate advantage asymmetrically to those who have fewer kinetic means to leverage this, and we see this in the offensive cyber operations space. At the same time, I think there's a considerable shift strategically that we see within a number of member countries. And so I think it might be more difficult in the future than ever before to get on the same page. There's a lot of people who think that what we see in the United States is simply sort of a Trump phenomenon, and sort of, we'll just wait for the next election and it's hopefully going to go away. And it turns out one way or another, and regardless of, I think, which party is going to get elected, and I'll see Stan sort of what his views are on that, but I think there's a shift away from that foreign policy alliance that ultimately won the day at the beginning of World War II, sort of the elites from Washington through to New York and Boston, much more to sort of a very different foreign policy narrative that has always been present in the United States, but has been sort of in the background over the last 70 years. But that very much takes us back to the late 19th century in terms of the United States not needing all these complicated and expensive alliances, that the interests that the United States is looking to assert don't require as much multilateralism and as much investment as they did at the end of World War II. And so I think Americans are asking, why are we still doing this when we can achieve the same objectives bilaterally? I think Americans would also say, look, our key allies in Europe are fairly secure. There's no immediate sort of existential threat that the alliance hasn't been able to contain as it is. And at the same time, as we see, I think democracy is much more interesting in Europe than it's been in a long time. And I'm a Democrat, and I think we want to have different voices in this space. But I think it's going to make it more difficult to forge consensus, and it's also going to mean that the sort of compromises that we're forging among different positions is going to make it more difficult around the NATO table to reach consensus. And so if we want to reach consensus, and countries want to have a say, it will very much come down to, what are you going to bring to the table? And if you want to matter in that conversation, it means you have to bring real capabilities and real commitments to that table, which is going to be increasingly difficult in societies that are facing considerable demographic aging, where there's going to be a lot of competition for the defense and security dollars from a whole wide array of welfare states, social service, education, whatever portfolios. And so a lot of people think there's going to be a whole lot more money. I think, unless the Russians actually really invade, we say in Canada that the only way we're going to get to 2% is if the Americans invade. And if the Americans invade, then it's kind of too late already. So, short of that, I think we're going to have to think about how do we optimize the spending that we have. And so I actually think rather than focusing on 2% and whatnot, it's actually distracting us from the many inefficiencies that we have as collective action problems within the alliance, so that we think much more systematically about how we can harness what Elisabeth has laid out about the fraternity of the uniform that we've built across the alliance into also making sure we achieve the best synergies, and we actually have an alliance that overcomes the fallacy of composition for the greater benefit of all its members.
Okay, thank you. Hester?
Challenges, right? The challenges for NATO for the next 70 years. Well, many of them have been alluded to, and I think the common denominator is that the world is changing. On the other hand, I'm optimistic, seeing also that NATO has been able to adapt over the last 70 years, that there will be also adaptation for the next period to come. But indeed, it's difficult in the sense that you have maybe the old foes who are still there, and there's a reason also to be on high alert and to really see what's happening in Russia and how some of the speeches of Putin will actually translate in a certain weaponization on that front, and how to counter that, and how to make sure that your deterrence is still credible also in that respect. But it's also about other countries coming up, of course, with bigger powers that claim their part of power plays as well, and how to deal with that. And also that might divert some attention of some of the allies to that part of the region, no longer at Europe itself. But I do think also that things like climate change might jeopardize the stability that we have in the region around Europe now at the moment. If sea level would rise to a certain extent, there will be lots of flooding also in Egypt, to indicate that there will be many people on the run also on how to deal with that. It's also about things like cyber and hybrid and counterterrorism. How do we deal with that? And how do you define hybrid? And how do you come to a consensus that a hybrid attack is actually happening and that you have to do something? It's also about things like the INF, the Russian violation, and how to deal with that, how to keep NATO unity also in the short term on these kind of discussions, and making sure that as one, you try at least to get Russia back into compliance, or in another way, make sure that you face whatever comes of that. I do think that also there it's still good to see what NATO then brings to the table to the different allies and how we can reinforce each other. And I'm still very much of the opinion that NATO has an answer to many of these, that unity is first and foremost the answer, that we should increase indeed and make sure that also the deterrence still remains credible, so both on the conventional side also, but also in terms of cyber. And I think that is something where we all have to invest more, and all have to be more aware on what kind of investments we have to make in that respect.
Okay. When you talk about other countries showing their power, are you referring to China, for instance?
Yes. Well, not so much in the sense that it's different, and I think it's very important to underline also. We had a debate in Parliament just the other day as well, and the Minister clearly also pointed out that it's not that we have to look at what the rise of China will mean for the alliance, and where there's opportunities, these are opportunities to seize, but where there's less of an opportunity and maybe difficulties, we should also be very much aware of those.
New countries, old countries, what is it, Stan?
Well, I think I've got a somewhat more traditional answer to your question. And I've got three challenges. The first one, to my mind, is the most important. And that is that somehow we have to rebuild mutual trust and confidence between the two sides of the Atlantic, which has been undermined by the American president over the last few years, and undermined over a longer period of time by the lack of effective European defense efforts, or at least not sufficient European defense efforts. And so the first challenge to my mind is rebuild mutual confidence, and part of that challenge is figuring out how to do that on both sides of the Atlantic. Now that's number one. The second one is I've heard a little bit of that in the presentation so far, but the second challenge, I think, is to make sure that we reestablish the principal foundation for the alliance. The challenge of illiberal politics and politicians in recent years calls into question not just politics in individual countries, it actually goes against the values of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law on which the alliance was founded. And in fact, we have one leader in Europe who even calls for what he likes as illiberal democracy. Well, I think that's the second challenge, is to perhaps reinvent liberal democracy in a way that responds more effectively to the needs of the average person, because in many ways, the failures of our governments have created fertile ground for the right-wing radical, illiberal politicians and parties to move in and take advantage of that ground. The third challenge that I see is perhaps a little bit more traditional. I think the first two are traditional, but very specific to the current circumstances. But the third challenge is to figure out how to deal effectively with the challenges posed by Russia and China. And China is definitely coming into the picture. I know that what I read today was that the foreign ministers in Washington today were going to discuss China as a challenge to security for the first time, because it certainly has not been on the NATO table in the past, and there still is obvious political reluctance to talk about it, because the challenge from China is very different than the challenge from Russia. But I think that that is something now that has to be on the table and effectively discussed by the Allies.
Okay. We live in uncertain times, and as Christian wrote today in his op-ed piece for the Global Mail, nothing less than the survival of NATO is at stake. So how convinced are you all that NATO will survive Donald Trump?
I could start. I'm very confident. NATO.
You are confident?
Yes, I am. It's a long-term confidence, short-term pessimism, because we can always find ways to screw things up, and we do manage that on both sides of the Atlantic. But long-term, just because I don't really see, and I've been dealing with academics for so many years who argue that NATO is done, it's over, but no one has ever come up with a formula that will work as well for Europe or the United States. And I even included that, the idea of a European army. My answer to that has been and will continue to be that there's no such thing as a European army possible until there's a European political union. And I don't see that on the near horizon. And so, show me an alternative that will work for both of us, and I'll say, okay, we should consider it. But so far, no one has come up with that.
Okay. Hester, are you convinced that NATO will survive Donald Trump?
Yes, I do think, and many other of us as well, in the sense that I think it's good to to distinguish between politics on the one hand and good policies on the other hand. And I think that many of our countries in the alliance, everybody's very much ingrained to the fact that NATO is good policy. It might not always be related to good politics, or it might not, when it comes to discussions about burden sharing and these kind of things, it might be easier for politicians to have a certain outspoken opinion of it, but in the basics, it really provides us with a certain value of security that indeed I agree is nowhere else to be found.
Christian, you wrote today, the survival of NATO is at stake. That was your last sentence. So, you're not entirely convinced, a bit worried?
Well, I think there's probably some discourse that we could do well to abandon if we actually wanted an alliance to survive. And I think the first place to start is burden sharing. Barry Bazan at MIT, has pointed out, why is it that both the Allies and the US find any discussion about burden sharing so difficult? Is because the Americans know the Allies won't spend 2%, and the Allies all know that the Americans will never relent on their expectation that they spend 2%. So let's just drop the conversation and just actually have more productive conversations around the actual challenges that we all that we collectively face. But look, I think the phenomenon that is the current political executive in the U.S. was, of course, foreseeable, because it was brought on by all the critics. This is not a political comment one way or the other, but it was brought on by the critics of the Obama administration, who for 8 years kept hammering that America is going to hell in the handbasket and America's status is declining in the world and whatnot. And so what did the critics get? They got exactly what they asked for, right? Make America Great Again is a direct reaction. It's the antithesis to 8 years of that sort of critical discourse. And so we need to realize that words and discourse have meaning and can create and have repercussions in terms of creating certain types of realities. And I think we need to be aware that should there be a re-election of the current administration in the US, my colleague Elliot Cohen, well known to Stan, currently vice dean at SAIS, he makes the point that the US will be a very different place if you get another 4 years of the Trump administration, as will much of the US administration. Because in 4 years,
Is it an empty place?
it will be a very different place. But you can already see in terms of the restructuring that this administration has undertaken, just in the way of not staffing a whole series of positions. And so I think we need to be prepared that we may be in for a very different type of relationship and future with the Americans. And from the beginning, I think the quote that you started with is keeping the Americans in was always a concern within the alliance, and that from a European perspective, we're going to have to work much harder. And I think that will, as I say, require both in terms of expenditures, capabilities, and commitments, doing a whole lot more to convince the Americans and those 40% who continue to support the administration. And let's remember, if you're starting an election at 40%, it doesn't take a whole lot more to make it over the bar. And I think many leaders in Europe would be happy to have a 40% baseline of support within their constituency.
Okay.
So
Stan talked about trust. How damaging to NATO is the fact that the leader of NATO questions all the time for the past 2 years the relevance of the organization? How damaging is that for the cohesion of the alliance?
Well, never let a good crisis go to waste. So on that premise, I think we can all do well on with a challenge function. And we need to understand that I think just the way I think many Europeans tend to misread the US public, and I think Elizabeth's points is very well taken, that the US public is not the elites in Boston, Washington, or New York. The US public and the US electorate and the disproportionate sway of the US electorate in smaller states that tend to have values quite different from those urban centers, I think is something that we should not underestimate going forward. And I would say that there are many ways to engage with the US. I think Jens Stoltenberg has known this for a long time, but there's still this perception that your main interlocutor is the US president, and I think we've understood that Congress, governors, state legislatures are all very important constituencies, many of which hold as much sway internationally or more than many European countries or NATO members.
Elizabeth, you more or less said, well, this is only talk for diplomats, this is the diplomatic bubble. The outside audience thinks differently about this.
It is. I think Putin is laughing all the way to the bank now, listening to the think tank discourse and the sort of talking heads talking about NATO and predicting the end of the transatlantic alliance. And we are making our adversaries' job very easy for them by engaging in this sort of self-destruction by means of public discourse. I mean, in liberal democracies, we all get to say that things aren't going well if we think they aren't going well. But if one looks at the engine of NATO, which is really the armed forces, it's chugging along nicely, and including the funding for the European Deterrence Initiative. Yes. I'm not even going to mention Trump because everybody else mentions him, but I wish we Europeans would be a bit less arrogant towards America and actually engage with people other than the usual suspects we meet on the coasts, because actually they're worth engaging with because they do fund our security. And I was on a recent panel with, I was in your role with 3 politicians, including a former prime minister who shall remain nameless, and I said to them, what would you tell people in Des Moines, Iowa, if you had to explain to them why it makes sense for them to fund their troops to go and serve in our countries? And he said, well, they wouldn't even know where my country is, so I wouldn't bother. And with this sort of attitude, I mean, why should they fund us? And I think we should do a little soul searching when it comes to our own attitude, and also I think everybody here in the room is engaged in the wider defense community. So I think it's a task maybe for all of us to engage in a little public diplomacy on our own with ordinary Americans that are not on the think tank circuit.
I'd just like to get back in on the burden sharing question.
Well, she talks about funding, and
I've spent a lot of my life working on the burden sharing issue, for better or worse. And I'm wondering if anybody knows what the first burden sharing crisis in the alliance was.
does anybody know it? No. Sorry? Kennedy.
Actually, that there certainly was a crisis then, but I'm going back even further. In my mind, the first burden sharing crisis in the alliance came in December of 1953, when John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, came to the NATO foreign ministers meeting and said that if the Europeans didn't produce a European defense community, that the United States was going to have an agonizing reappraisal of its commitment in Europe. It was the only time before Trump that an American administration has threatened to pull back on the American commitment, even though Kennedy certainly was very concerned about burden sharing. But I think that's just an interesting perspective that has history. But let me just say, thinking about burden sharing, I've just come to the conclusion that in an alliance of democracies, there will always be a burden-sharing problem. Why? Because every government, every leader is going to try to get the best, highest level of security for the lowest price. And if you've got every leader basically taking that approach, there's going to be a burden-sharing problem. And then when you have countries of such diverse GDP and strength and so forth, you're going to have this the United States at the top paying more, inevitably, and other countries paying less all along the spectrum. So to my mind, the burden-sharing problem is one that for NATO will never be solved. It can be managed, it has to be managed effectively, but never solved.
So you don't think NATO will reach the 2% majority at a certain point in history?
My feeling about 2% is that it's foolish for any organization to set an objective that it probably knows it isn't going to meet.
Yeah.
And I think probably this is what has happened. I would like to see, obviously, a set of goals for the alliance that include more output measures and less focus on the input measure. The output measure is much more effective in terms of the alliance and what it can do. But as we know, politicians like the simplicity of this 2% goal, and they kind of grasp onto it now, particularly American members of Congress, and it makes it easier for them to understand.
Yeah.
The output measures are more complex, more difficult to understand.
Elizabeth talked about arrogance. If you look at the German budget plan for 2023, they're aiming to reach 1.23, and they lack about 25 billion because the German defense minister has asked more. So those are the facts on the ground. Isn't that shameful? That one of the leading countries in Europe is not delivering.
But then if Germany spends that much more, who's going to be concerned? Because Germany will become a much larger, important military power, and that could be destabilizing for its Western neighbors.
So, conclusion?
Conclusion is that the alliance made a big mistake in getting onto the 2% objective, and now we've got to live with that mistake. But in Germany, the problem with Germany is going to be a problem in U.S.-German relations.
Hester, sorry for teasing you a bit, but the Dutch are at 1.35%.
Yes, but it's also that
Is it painful?
these are projections. Also,
Yeah.
it's currently, but also we're working towards 2024 to reach to the 2%, and that has been a commitment of our Prime Minister over and over again. That's also something that we're working on. We have made a national plan which is much more focused on output, as you said. It's really about what kind of capabilities do you need and what kind of capabilities have we also as the Netherlands signed up to. And then it's of course also budget cycles, and you have to go through these discussions with other politicians who are at the same table, also claiming part of the money of the budget that's there. So that will be another round of talks pretty soon. I hope, of course, for a good outcome as well from those talks. But then also that's not the end of it when talking for the Netherlands, because then there will be a defense review also later on. So we're not at 2024 yet, and there's a good commitment from our side.
So you think that you hope that the Netherlands will do more? You think it's possible?
We've committed to do more.
Yeah. Well.
Yes, and also in that respect, of course, it's about output, but it's also about what do you do with it.
Yeah.
You can spend tons of money on your services, have nice and shiny military hospitals, and keep your shoulders at bay, but that's not the point of having it also. Yeah. So I think when it comes to burden sharing, it's also, of course, when we talk, for instance, about the enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, we've talked about it many times also with some of the Baltic ambassadors and so on. But that's about NATO solidarity. I think, being there with all NATO countries, showing that you're there and that you care also for the security of those countries. So it's these kind of things. It's the out-of-area operations that NATO undertakes, that we've been undertaking together with the US for the first time that Article 5 was actually called upon in Afghanistan. We're still there. So it's these kind of commitments, I think, that matter much more for the alliance and also for the solidarity within the alliance than just the money.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to open.
Robert.
Can I just react to a couple of things that Hester?
Very briefly, because I'll
keep it really brief.
And
But I think Elizabeth wants to get in on this as well. Look, when we talk about the 2%, we always forget a whole number of things. So I think the French defense minister made a nice point about it's Article 5, not Article F-35. The point around this was that 2% also benefits the US defense industry. And so this is part of course, why the Americans will always push higher expenditures. The Americans are the one federation in the advanced industrialized democratic world that does not have a fiscal equalization system. So inherently, higher defense spending within the US is also a mechanism of keeping a whole bunch of constituencies appeased that in other countries we keep appeased by other means. Then of course, the Americans now spending 3.5% or so of GDP doesn't include account for the fact that we have a social system where we offload many of these expenses onto other budgets within our public expenditures that in the US end up counting as defense budgets. And even things like Coast Guard stuff is one example. Of course, as our economies continue to grow, we do spend more money on defense. It's just that as a proportion of GDP, it might remain relatively stable. So investing more means not just more money, but proportionately more money. And so I think so we always need to temper this conversation. There's some subjective dimensions to this.
Okay.
I think 2% is the most unhelpful conversation ever. Because essentially we treat each other and everybody else as some sort of idiots that we don't understand what exactly national defense is supposed to entail. And I mean, it's like infantilizing the public that as if 2% is, or the figure 2 is the only thing they're able to understand. What if we started telling them, talking about that? Can I just ask who would be in favor of a discourse that focuses more on output than input?
Maybe.
Yeah, a number of hands. And I think actually the wider public, so it's always said, oh, it's too difficult to explain what output entails, but actually I think the wider public would like to understand what it is they are supposed to fund, as opposed to just being given the number 2, and that's supposed to then be the complete explanation. And I think in our day and age, the year 2019, where most people have completed high school or beyond, they are able to understand what is required for the defense of a country within the lines.
Thank you. Now it's time to open up our debate. May I ask you to mention your name and your affiliation, and to please, due to the limited time, refrain from long statements, propaganda, whatsoever. Brief questions, please. We have a high-level panel flew all the way from the United States and Canada to be here. Gentlemen there. Can we have the mic there, please?
My name is Eric de Munk. I've got a question.
And you work where?
Oh, I work with 2 companies, EDM Consultancy and Falcom.
Okay.
So it's my own company. My question is about how does the thinking of the French, mostly Macron, of building a European army going against Nato? Because I think the Europeans got scared by Mr. Trump, which is not necessary, I think. I didn't hear anything about European army, about France, I think about gaullism. Maybe someone can say something about this. I'm very interested.
Okay. To what extent is a European army also a kind of rivalry for NATO?
Look, the French talk about a European army whenever they run into domestic trouble, right? You got to distract from what's happening at home, and you kind of have this broader conversation. But I think it's, from a Canadian perspective, it's fundamentally problematic, because it would mean if the Europeans ever got their act together on defense, that Canada would be left on the outside looking in, so this sort of strategic autonomy conversation. But if you notice, he's toned that down substantially, even in the last few months. So I think this waxes and wanes, but given the nuclear umbrella and the capacities that the US can bring on everything from nuclear deterrence to biosecurity and whatnot, and new challenges, I don't think this is really on the horizon anytime soon. And there is, of course, a lot of European coordination that is already quite helpful, and I think enhances both the interests of the EU and NATO, so it's not necessarily a zero-sum game.
Okay, Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's basically a paper tiger. In fact, it's not even a paper tiger, it's an air tiger. because it's just a word at the moment, a concept that comes up every now and then. And actually, the most successful European defense integration so far is the cooperation between this country and Germany, the integration with 43rd Mechanized Brigade into the 1st Panzer Division, which is really a phenomenally successful undertaking that has taken a lot of time and commitment from both sides. And this is integration from the ground up. 2 countries, very limited integration, but it works. And so this is, I think, where we'll be heading.
Hester, is it a paper tiger?
I think there's a difference between the European army is you know, it's indeed something that every now and then erupts, but doesn't really entangle much. You don't have a NATO army either, so why talk about a European army? But I do think, and that's why I was so surprised by your remark earlier on, in 1953, the first issue of burden sharing, the request from the United States on Europe to come up with a defense union. And this is something that we've been trying within the European Union for several times. We had the VEU, we had to, so we tried at the beginning, and now we have this permanent European structured cooperation. There's a whole alphabet soup created in European abbreviations, but that's all about how can the European countries cooperate better together in order to, one, have better capabilities and maybe more capabilities, develop these capabilities together, make sure that you have the capabilities that are needed for the 21st century. And the other thing is, how can you make sure that we can do some out-of-area operations by ourselves, there where the United States might not be too interested in doing that, or simply just because it's our responsibility, because it's our neighbors.
But does it mean that Europe will stay soft power, to quote Joseph?
No, actually, what I'm saying is that there will be this capability development between European Union countries. And that causes also in itself a bit of friction, because you just mentioned before that the idea in the US that also if there's more money in the 2%, more money will be spent on the defense industry within Europe, within the United States. And this might, come up with certain difficulties in that respect. So give us some time. I will be in a panel about NATO at 70 and CSDP at 20. So there's still a lot to learn, I think, in the European Union for its own capability developments and so on.
Okay. This gentleman there on the 3rd floor.
Yeah, I will answer it.
Sorry?
I'm the French defense attaché, so maybe I can give you my view.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly all what President Macron's reflection is, but first of all, we need diversity in the alliance, and we need to discuss. You advocated democracy, so that's an example. Don't forget that before NATO we had the Dunkirk Treaty, 1947, between the UK and France, and 1948, the Brussels Treaty between, then there was Benelux in addition, so 5 countries. So there was already a vision of European defense, and it continues, and it works. You have the European Air Transport Command in Eindhoven, commanded by a French general currently, and you have some European coordination with like-minded and like-equipped countries to coordinate air transport, and we can do more. Currently, we are working on the European Intervention Initiative. It's an idea of President Macron with like-minded countries with operational added value. Think of Denmark, for instance. The Brits are in, the Germans are in, the Netherlands are in, and if we take France, the UK, and the Netherlands, we were together in 1995 around Sarajevo to get rid of the heavy weapons over there. So we are able to conduct operations together. So it can be useful to bridge the gaps where NATO cannot go outside of Article 5 areas, and also when NATO is kind of blocked for political reasons. Think about the Eastern Mediterranean.
Okay, so no rivalry?
No, I don't think so. I think there is a lot to do and to deliver in terms of security. Also in Africa, it has an impact on Europe. In the north, we discussed it last week, so it's important for the cohesion of NATO as well, and it's time to discuss. And we are discussing also with the Americans about the European Intervention Initiative. So, European Army, maybe it's not best formulated, but there are some projects.
Okay, excellent. Next. So, Stan.
Yeah, if I could just make a comment on that. Obviously, anything that Europeans can do and do in the EU framework or do in bilateral, trilateral framework that improves European defense capabilities is a good thing. And the United States should look very favorably on that. The problem is that there have been times when ideas about European army or defense autonomy, European aircraft carrier, I mean, there are a lot of kind of wild proposals, but there have been times during the Iraq War, for example, when the French government and Belgian government, a couple of others got together talking about creating a European planning cell. That created a huge problem inside the alliance because it was seen as something that would compete with NATO. We've moved away from that, and I'm very pleased to say that the cooperation between NATO and the European Union has, over recent years, has gotten better and better, and particularly since France rejoined the integrated command structure, the coordination is much more effective. But it's important to talk about practical things that can be done. And sometimes political leaders get carried away with rhetoric, and we understand that. But it's important to focus on things that actually produce outcomes, that produce improvements in defense capabilities. And I see a lot of that going on. So I think in many ways we're in a better position in that area than we have been for a long time. And it's just that with the reaction to Trump has produced a lot of kind of wild ideas that don't necessarily work. The one of the aircraft carrier really puzzled me because then people don't seem to understand that you can't just have an aircraft carrier, you need a carrier group, you need submarines, surface ships to protect it, you need all of that stuff, and then you're talking real money. But in any case, that's, I think it's important to talk about what can be done practically, and whatever can be done on the European side that improves defense capabilities is positive.
Gentlemen, second row.
Yeah, my name is Frank Dennison. I'm the secretary of the Data Sister, that's the Liberal Democrats, for those of you, think tank on defense. I always follow this by saying that what I say is on my own behalf, what I hear goes to the relevant people. My question is, Sven Bischoff of the Egmont Institute predicted as a possible future for NATO the writing of an ETO, an European Treaty Organization. So it would be an ETO, NATO's future would, in his view, be an ETO-US alliance. Now, I think that would be Mr. Leuprecht's big bugbear, because that would have Canada and a few others looking in from the outside. So, please, have at it.
Is that realistic? Christian? ETO?
Look, if you look at this sociologically, and you look at the polls, and Frédéric Marron has actually done an interesting book on this, that in no European country is there even close to majority support to have their people die for Europe. And so I think we can have institutional discussions about collaboration, but I think sociologically, in terms of legitimizing that as an entity, that as a European actor, for which people are prepared to pay, and for which people are prepared to have their people die, we are a long way from that. That being said, I do think there is potential, especially in spaces of emerging threats. And so the biosecurity threat, the resilience piece, the civil response unit that NATO has stood up both to deal with the constant multi-level attacks that the Baltic states are facing, in the aftermath of Novichok, the Skripal issue in the UK, where it became apparent if this happened in a small member country, wouldn't be able to identify what's going on, how to contain it, how to respond to it. I do think there's an opportunity here to coordinate on these on these new emerging threats, perhaps in a way that might be more effective than dealing with the United States, where, for instance, on many of these emerging threats, there are very specific set ideas in the US of what that threat is and how to deal with it. where a more broader European conversation might actually be able to make greater inroads than bringing
But we don't need an organization without Canada. That's the question.
Look, there's a reason why Canada was a member from the outset, and so I think the value added both for Canada and for the alliance has been a mutual benefit, mutual strategic benefit, and there's no question that, I mean, our most important strategic alliance is with the United States, but that our relationship with Europe is our second most important strategic relationship. And I think many European countries, especially given the challenges perhaps that some perceive in the US, think of Canada as an important value added as a counterpiece in North America.
Canada is in a very special position because the United States has no choice but to defend Canada because it's part of our security space. If Canada is attacked, the United States has to respond, treaty commitments or not.
And as I always like to say, the Americans are our best friends, whether we like it or not.
Okay. Well, the Western European Union has been mentioned. We have Mr. Van Ekelen.
Yes.
Former Minister of
He
Defense.
thinks I will only talk about European Union. No, I served with NATO for 4.5 years in 66. 66 to 71. And it was a great experience. And I think all our armies have learned a great deal from that experience, doing things together, looking at problems in the same way. So far, so good. Today, I think the great problem with NATO is A, there's no American leadership. B, NATO has not been doing anything in terms of operations. The only thing, and I'm not denigrating that has certain importance, is in the Baltic countries, but all the peacekeeping missions in our terminology have not been done by NATO. And so I agree with Elisabeth. I'm not in favor of a European army. In the first place, NATO does not have an army either. But B, nobody knows what it means. And so I'm in favor of your step-by-step, bottom-up approach, like the Netherlands are doing with Belgium in terms of the Navy. That's an efficient way, not only for operations, but also for new equipment. We have something similar with the Germans, brigade in the German Panzer Division. So that is the right way. But now, the only body where there is a political approach in security matters is not NATO. NATO only deals with security questions, unfortunately. So I think probably NATO will have to make a division and say, for collective defense, we have a separate operation, separate division, and we have a division which works closely with European Union for all the other missions. Because all the other missions are basically European, not NATO. So, but I'm not saying that they should be separate from NATO if NATO is prepared to go along. But just to say that it would be against NATO, no. It would reinforce NATO.
Yeah.
The PESCO, which we are doing now, which is, I think, too disorganized, okay, but at least it looks at European capabilities in terms of equipment. That is, I think, the right approach. So the question is not, will NATO survive having reached 70 years, is what is NATO going to do?
Okay.
And in that terms, I think it is much less than it did in the past. And we have to be aware.
Thank you very much. Elisabeth, what is your answer to this?
Yes, if I can combine the three previous questions, including your comments, from the French defense attaché. So it boils down to I think the need for pragmatism, or actually the success of pragmatism. So I was reminded of back during the Cold War, the communists in various Central and Eastern European countries built huge palaces, or what they called palaces, which were really just monstrous buildings. And then they said, oh, what are we going to put in this building? They couldn't think of anything, so they had enormous buildings that were pretty empty. And the more pragmatic approach is to say, okay, we need to build a house here, so we'll build a house, and that serves our needs. And I think it's the same way with European defense. Instead of coming up with the European Army or an ETO, one can follow up on the success actually of the EATC, which is, it serves a particular need, which is air transport capacity, and the countries that wanted to pool their fleet did so, and it works very well. But it's a very limited area where they have decided to pool their resources. So why not build on that? And so the French, the Dutch, Belgian Navy is another example. The Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian Air Forces pool their well, they exercise together in the Swedish Finnish Air Force. They also share airfields and so forth. That's bottom up, and it works, and it's based on a pragmatic need.
And you would like to see more of that?
Yes.
Small coalitions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Based on an existing need.
Okay.
Well, I also think that it's very important to be as pragmatic as possible, but also to see where the added value of the organization of the European Union, for instance, could enforce what NATO wants to do and vice versa. And I think especially in areas like cyber, hybrid threats and so on, the EU has a larger toolbox at its disposal than NATO might have. But if the two of them combine their forces, then it's even more forceful. As you mentioned, for instance, Skripal, where there was both from the European Union side and from the NATO side, there was this big condemnation of what happened. There was a very clear coordinated action with diplomats being withdrawn and all these kind of things. So
that's at the political level.
At the political level. But also doing that together. For the OPCW hack that we had here was the same amount of unity that was shown at that time. But the EU, for instance, is now working on the cyber sanction regime. The US has their own sanctions. So it's also in these fields where you can have much more cooperation and make sure you enforce each other. And on European defense cooperation, I think that's also very much in support of what NATO needs. So it's the requirements. We all have only one set of forces, so it contributes to both of them anyway.
Stan, you as an American, are you laughing? Europe finally showing its teeth?
No, I was. Wim has raised a question that's a very important one. The mandate that NATO has is not necessarily as broad as we might want for security cooperation between the United States and Europe, given the current challenges. In fact, Wim may remember in the early 2000s, this is one thing that convinced me that new organizations are difficult to get into serious consideration. In that period, I wrote up the idea of a transatlantic security community that would involve all members of NATO and all members of the European Union, plus the leadership of both organizations, and that organization would consult and cooperate on the non-military aspects of security, which cover a very wide area. Well, the responses that I got from all around were, oh, there's so many organizations already, we don't need new organizations, but it is definitely a challenge, and that there are a lot of security issues that NATO does not have a mandate to deal with.
Okay. Gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Hester Somsen. I'm from Manchester. I'm a security analyst and also a member of the Liberal Democrats. So my question is...
this is the last Liberal Democrat I have question.
Yes. So my question is, so many argue there is no puzzle to be explained because the NATO no longer allies. So if I go deeply, rather than it's been transformed something else, perhaps the regional collective security management was Mr. Walder and Mr. Cohen in 1999 mentioned in one of his books. He says, I've been called a security management constitution such as argument, however, would you still beg the question how and why NATO was able to perform the debate intense itself? So the existence of NATOs in Europe is threat in Russia, if it still exists, the NATO will exist. So, what are you guys saying about this question?
Could you repeat it, please? Because I only heard fragments of it, and I couldn't.
Oh, my question is, so many people arguing that.
You don't have to repeat the whole question, but the last part of it.
The last bit. So, other point that we always ask ourselves, that NATO collectively is a threat posed by the remain to Soviet Union, to not apply the Russia. So, if the NATO existed is based because of if the Russia threat is continuously Russian aggressive, then NATO will exist in Europe. If it's not there, that means NATO will not exist anymore.
Mm-hmm. Is that correct? The gentleman is asking. Is that correct?
Well, so if Putin retired tomorrow, would NATO be obsolete? I think.
2024. That's the reply.
Yeah, but I'm an optimist. It could happen tomorrow.
Okay.
So the reality is that the threats against our societies are changing, and it's not just about territorial invasion anymore, and it's about and not just about the Russian state. It's about proxy actors acting on behalf of other countries. And by the way, that means also that they don't have to be in close proximity to Europe. They could be located somewhere completely different, but have the intention of weakening NATO or the transatlantic alliance. I'm not going to mention any particular countries, but there are countries that want to weaken the transatlantic alliance or Europe or the US. And so NATO, I think, has shown itself capable of adapting in the past. And I think that would be a formidable challenge to adapt to, but it just shows how important it is that NATO remains in place and agile.
Okay, I think you were hinting at Russia.
I think it's important to understand that NATO is not just a military alliance, it's also a political alliance. And it has a foundation based on certain values. And at the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of talk about, well, do we need NATO anymore? And the nations all decided that even if the Soviet threat, becoming the Russian threat, was not what it used to be, and might not be the same, provide the same rationale for the alliance, the Allies all decided that NATO still remained a good insurance policy, and that it's best to keep it around. And this was the decision that was made in the North Atlantic Council by the Allies. And I think probably today, those people who made that decision would say they made the right choice, because as I think it was possible to predict that Russia would go back to a more authoritarian style of government after the chaotic situation of the 1990s. I wasn't surprised by it. They have not had a history of experience with democracy. They were really not effective in handling it. It became chaotic. Russian people really didn't like what was going on, and so they ended up back in a more authoritarian government. Now, to talk about what would happen if Russia changed into a liberal democracy someday, it would be an interesting discussion. But I think we're a long way from that point, and that until that happens, then I think there's no question about NATO continuing.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Elisabeth Braw has to catch a plane, an 8:20 flight back to London. So please give her an applause. Great. Ladies and gentlemen, so we are reaching the end. So I think we have another 10 minutes. So I would like to ask only very short, punctual questions. We haven't had a question yet on the new arms race. Is there anybody who's asked? Of course, we have former Minister Defense Joris Stolf in the room.
I don't want to raise the new arms race, but point out that we haven't discussed yet the war going on in Europe, which has killed already some 15,000 people, about 500,000 refugees. Ukraine. What are NATO members, I'm not talking about NATO, what are NATO members able to do to help shore up that big European country?
Okay. So to jump in that question.
A lot of the work obviously has to be done by the Ukrainians themselves, and the assistance from NATO members has been very uneven. The United States now has started giving more assistance than was being given, more lethal arms being provided, but in fact it really is going to be up to the Ukrainians. I think the main thing that NATO countries can do is to continue to put pressure on Russia. The Ukrainians to some extent are their own worst enemies, but they do have a serious enemy in Russia that does not want Ukraine to become anything that looks like a Western-style government that is aligned with the West, that becomes a member of the EU, and they certainly don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. But I think it's very important for the Western countries to continue to give Ukraine support in all ways, to continue also to try to convince the Ukrainians to clean up corruption to the extent that they can in their political system, to do everything that they can to move closer to Western standards of governance. So I think it's a two-way street. The Ukrainians have to do a lot on their own, but I think Western Europeans could do more, Europeans in general could do more, as could the United States in supporting that effort.
Yes, do you agree? Europe should do more on Ukraine?
Well, I think it's very difficult in the sense that, of course, there's these political processes going on, and you see that there's little willingness and little room for maneuver, and I think that's where the pressure needs to be indeed, also on from the European countries onto the Russian Federation. But it's a difficult party to press, also, I must say, at the moment.
Yeah. What's the Dutch standpoint?
Well, that's the same. So we support, of course, the Minsk process and everything that's going on there, and we hope, in that respect, that also pressure from both France and Germany will lead to some of the solutions soon. But also, we have to see how now the presidential elections play out, how these kind of things will turn out. But indeed, also the corruption and the way the Ukrainians sometimes are dealing with certain issues, like, for instance, the Russian language issue, is not helping them.
Okay.
Thank you. Sabine Nurka, I'm the Canadian ambassador here. I couldn't let the comments on whether Canada should be a NATO challenge. I think my simple answer is yes. I think it behooves people to remember that in both world wars, Canada came to the defense of Europe years before the United States did. And I suppose ask any Dutch citizens about the contribution of Canadian forces in the conflict zone. My question, though, is more practical and more future-oriented than looking back. But one more comment on Ukraine. Canada is actually doing all the things that you're saying need to be done for Ukraine. We're doing military assistance, capacity building, anti-corruption activities, development assistance. We're doing it all. It's of course helped by the fact that Canada is about 10% Ukrainian. I think we have a Ukrainian population of about 3.5 million. The question that I have is about the new threats, the emerging threats, the new form, I suppose I would call it, of asymmetrical warfare, i.e. governments against civilian populations and democracies. At a time when an F-35 costs about the same as running a troll farm of 900 people in St. Petersburg, how should NATO realign how it spends the resources that it is given by the states? I think that would be a direct and simple question, maybe, to the panel. Thank you.
Who wants to take up that question?
Well, I've written about this problem, and I think it gets also to a couple of the other questions that we had, which is that I think what a lot of people don't realize is, so there's lots of complaints, and the media love writing about this, about how top-heavy our military organizations are. And we've got all these generals, and what are all these generals doing? And why do we need all these generals? Well, it turns out that the security environment over the last 30 years has gotten very complex. Life was pretty easy when the main objective was the existential threat from Russia. But now we have a plethora of threats, many of which have existential dimensions to them. And for all of these, we need a component within our often military organizations, although it's not solely a military toolkit that responds to these, to run these, whether it's cyber, biosecurity, it's security sector reform, it's ballistic missile defense, It's the whole preoccupation now with well-being of our soldiers when they come back. I know I have like a list of like 30 of these different things that we're doing now that we didn't, even at the end of the Cold War, weren't doing. And so in many ways, this is why our defense organizations are as stretched as they've ever been, because we have all these new tasks, many of which are not immediately apparent or visible to many of our populations. And I think the one of the benefits of NATO has been that in many of these areas, cooperation has meant that we are able to try to stay at least one step ahead of the game by having certain specializations. And I think one of the examples was when Syria came up, the country that retained the capacity on former and Soviet bloc chemical warfare was Slovakia. And so kind of trying to figure out where the comparative advantages are, I think there's the complexity of this environment, I think, means there's a lot more systematic thinking that needs to go into this, and needs to go into things that don't go boom, because most of the threats that we're facing aren't things that go boom. And there's kind of like Frank Smith at the University of Sydney has done a fantastic book on American biowarfare. And one of the problems with why the Americans have always underperformed and underestimated the whole bio threat is essentially because it's an institutional culture of something that doesn't go boom. And I think this is where the Europeans and the EU have a comparative advantage. We can already see this in EU missions, rule of law missions, policing, whatnot missions, that I think Europe is much more sensitive to much more variegated threats that can be genuinely existential, but don't necessarily involve things that are kinetic.
Okay. I think we're running a bit out of time, but there's a gentleman who has a question, I think, on the arms race. Is that correct?
Yeah.
A very brief question.
Well, it's about a simple question, nuclear weapons, not mentioned.
Yes.
Is a nuclear
That's for you.
We talk about. My name is Peter Buys, IPPNW, International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War, Nobel Peace Prize 85, because it were the medical arguments who brought Gorbachev and Reagan, like they confirmed afterwards, to the table with the final arguments. A new arms race, nuclear arms race is looming, given the presentations by the US and Putin last year. And that would be completely the wrong direction. The coming years is 50 years of NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. All signatories of the treaty, that's almost the whole world, has promised there to Article 6 to go to the table to negotiate about complete nuclear disarmament. We wait 50 years on this, doing something on this article, and why doesn't NATO take the lead in bringing the world in safer conditions on this issue?
Okay, Hester?
Well, I
You
think,
are a player.
yes, and we've had this conversation, of course, like what can NATO do?
Yeah.
So actually, I would like to invite the gentleman on the left and the right of me to maybe give some other inspiring thoughts. So where we are at the moment is that NATO can, of course, as a group of countries who can discuss this, who have nuclear weapon states within the alliance, but also non-nuclear weapon states in the alliance. And as discussed before, it's good to have these conversations with each other, what would be the possibilities. For instance, when it comes to risk reduction, what kind of things would there be possible to make sure that at least risks are being set at a minimum for any kind of, God forbid, incident with these kind of weapons. So there are some possibilities for NATO as such, but these are limited and up to the willingness of the nuclear weapon states also, and what kind of creative ideas we can come up with as non-nuclear weapon states. So maybe some of the gentlemen to the right and the left have some great ideas on that as well.
Hard to be inspiring in this area. For one thing, the goal of total nuclear disarmament is one that is probably not going to happen in our lifetimes. It would be nice to think that it could be, but the fact is that you can't eliminate the knowledge of nuclear weapons from mankind, and so you have to try to find regimes, and beginning with arms control processes, that control and limit the risks. Now, in terms of the whole INF issue coming up again, it is, I think, one that's only going to be put back into the arms control framework if China is included. And I think this is looking at the emergence of China in this area. It is reasonable for the United States to want to see some kind, if there is going to be limitation on these systems, to include China in that framework. And so, to my mind, from a practical point of view, it moves beyond NATO. It obviously can be discussed in NATO, and perhaps should be. But the fact is that somehow, I think the only way that we're going to get back to an arms control solution is if it's involves China, Russia, and the United States.
I think, I'm actually not sure the conversation about nuclear weapons is helpful, because the conversation today is very different than the conversation 50 years ago. The weapons we have today are very different weapons in terms of medium and short-range weapons. They're much more precise. You can contain the effects and target the effects very differently. And so as a result, I actually think we live in a much higher risk environment of the use of nuclear weapons, precisely because of the way that the technology has evolved. At the same time, we do have a strategic concept that has worked reasonably well, which is mutual assured destruction, and in particular the nuclear deterrent that the United States offers, and that remains important. I would, however, say that we're not having the conversation that we need to be having, which is that while we have a strategic concept for nuclear weapons, we don't have a strategic concept for cyber. And I would say that the spillover effects, kinetic spillover effects from cyber attacks and the uncertainties associated with the cyber and offensive cyber environment are much more dangerous than nuclear weapons have ever been for our collective security. And here's an area where we don't have a strategic concept because the actors deliberately stay below the threshold of the use of force, which means that the treaties that we have, so NATO treaty, law of armed conflict, UN Convention of Human Rights, none of these apply. And so it's a genuine anarchic environment that is very dangerous.
It's obviously one of the most important arguments for preparing a new strategic concept, but the one thing that I think I feel, and most people probably would, is that process should not be started until Trump is gone. Because if you open the strategic concept to Trump, you don't know what you're going to get. So.
Okay, I think we have time for the final question. A very brief one.
Mr. Sloan, my name is Boris Farbro. You were mentioning about some issues where the NATO doesn't have a mandate for. Can you be more specific, giving me some examples, please?
Issues that
NATO doesn't have a mandate for.
Yeah, NATO's mandate is limited by the treaty. And obviously in the treaty, NATO can manage all kinds of defense cooperation and anything that has to do with not just collective defense, Article 5, but under Article 4, NATO is now relying much more on looking at the potential for threats to the alliance, and that has broadened the scope of alliance activities. But it doesn't necessarily cover all of the areas, and cyber certainly can be brought inside that framework. That's not a huge problem, that fits in the mandate. But there are geographic limitations which have been overcome to some extent. Look at Afghanistan. But the treaty does impose these specific limitations on geography and on the nature of the mission. And if activities don't fit inside those requirements of doing something that's necessary to protect the sovereignty and territory of NATO countries, then it falls outside the mandate. And if there's, for example, some peacekeeping operations, for example, that don't fall inside the mandate. And there are a number of areas like that. And NATO does look at one of the big threats, obviously, comes from the environment and environmental challenges. NATO has had a committee on the challenges of modern society since, actually, believe it or not, Richard Nixon proposed it way back when. And so NATO has dabbled in that area, but NATO doesn't really have a mandate to deal with coordination in this area. And that's one reason why way back in 2000 or so I wrote up this idea of a different transatlantic organization to manage the non-military aspects of security, because there are gaps there that are not met by the current institutional structure. And perhaps we'll get to looking at that at some point, but right now it is not at the top of our list of problems.
Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this program has come to an end, and don't worry, I won't summarize our entire debate. Let me share a few things that I will take home. We heard Elisabeth talking about that we shouldn't be in our bubble too much and listen more to people outside our own bubble, and don't be arrogant. I remember very clearly Hester talking about happiness, and that apparently NATO countries are very happy, so that's good news. And she also emphasized the intention of the Dutch government to work towards 2%. When, we don't know, but the intentions are there. I remember Christian talking very clearly about no Brexit procedures within NATO. On the contrary, countries want to get in instead of out. That's good news. And Stanley, he emphasized the need for building trust. And in a unilateral, more and more unilateral world, it's very important. My takeaway is that NATO will survive President Trump, but the burden sharing debate will continue, and that's not bad. It's good. The European countries need to do better, including the Dutch, and they're working on it. And in that sense, the pressure by Donald Trump is okay, and we should get used to it, at least until 2021, and perhaps even for another 4 years. So, is that optimism? Is that pessimism? Everybody knows the definition of a pessimist. That's a well-informed optimist. So, no famous last words from me, except for that the bar is open. Please give a round of applause for our panel. Thank you, dear ambassadors, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence. See you next time.